Just one. Someone's listening to this right now and they're like, okay, what's my first baby step? What can I do? Go.
Right. I mean, there's so many first baby steps you can do. I mean, which pillar do we want to look at? If we want to look at exercise and physical activity, okay, what can you take one step right now that you didn't take yesterday? You know, we talk about 10,000 steps. Well, if you're at, 500 steps because you barely get off the couch, get up, take a couple steps. Just doing something, moving around a little bit is going to be more than you've done yesterday. And then just do a little bit more tomorrow, a little bit more. What is it? Confucius said, the longest journey starts with a single step, I believe is the quote.
Wow.
So, not all of us are going to run a marathon. But, if you decide you want to run a marathon and you've never run a marathon and you're totally out of shape and you're 50 pounds overweight, well, go walk around the block. It might be a struggle to get around that block, but you walk around that block today, tomorrow you might get a little further and a little bit further. And you just keep moving a little bit more. When we look at diet, what's one small change that we can make today that can impact the number of calories we're putting in our bodies?
Right.
I use the example all the time in my classes that if you drink sugared pop or soda for those people that speak incorrectly, a 20-ounce bottle of pop is about 260 calories. So if you cut one of those a day, I forget off the top of my head how many calories that adds up to, and anybody can do the math. It's 365 times 260. But I remember, because I just did it recently in class, that it came out to about 16 2/3 pounds over the course of the year that you would gain if you increased that caloric intake, or you would lose if you decreased that. So if you simply stop drinking that one pop a day, that one 20-ounce pop, you can prevent yourself from gaining 16 pounds or lose 16 pounds if you go in a caloric deficit. So, I mean, that's a simple step. A little less unhealthy fats, eat a little bit more, eat one stalk of broccoli today that you didn't eat yesterday. That's a step in the right direction. Changing, your food intake a little bit more, eating a little bit more protein if you're not eating enough protein, eating a little less if you're eating too much protein. It's just baby steps. It's what about Bob?
Right.
Like, what am I trying to do? Okay, well, what's the first step I need to take to move in that direction?
So basically, I'm hearing, park farther away from the store to get your steps in. Don't necessarily utilize the elevator or escalator all the time. Take advantage of those stairs. If you're eating crummy, throw in some veggies in there. Add protein. Focus on protein, just real simple stuff.
Yeah.
Long story short, don't complicate it.
Right. It doesn't have to be complicated. And that's, again, why I want this to be the Aging Well podcast. We're getting rid of the complicatedness. We're simplifying the process of aging well. And it's not going to be about, okay, this is the expensive supplement you have to take, and it's going to cost you, I forget what, but I'm trying to remember now the supplement that wealthy longevity quote unquote expert. People couldn't see my air quotes if you're listening, but the supplement's like $360 some odd a day. I think it's well over $300 not a day, but a month. Most people can't afford that.
Right.
And that's only a partial part of what he's taking. So what are the simple things that we can do to make our quality of life better?
Yeah. I mean, I think that question is for the individual themselves, really. What do they want out of their life? If they took their life and they could squeeze as much awesomeness and produce as much of it as they can, what does that look like? What steps do they need to take? And I think if you're listening to this right now, you got to ask yourself that, and what goals are you going to be setting in order to accomplish that?
And if you don't know what steps to take to accomplish that, don't tune into this podcast, because that's our goal. And if we're not talking about it and you have a question, send us the question and we'll talk about it on this podcast. Yeah. That's our goal and purpose with this podcast, is to educate and to inspire.
So let's say we do have an individual who's they're like, I just don't know. I just don't have the time. I don't have the money. I don't have access. What do you say to a person who feels left behind by modern longevity?
Quote a person from Brooklyn, forget about it. It's
Forget about it.
you don't have to chase after these health upgrades. It's the small decisions that we're making, and longevity science. There's some good science out there, but it's very incomplete. And so understand that most of what you're being fed is either from influencers on social media or people who kind of have a product to sell or an agenda to sell. There's very few that are really diving into the science that is benefiting true longevity. And again, if you really want to kind of get deeper into the science, if you're that science minded, I will encourage people to watch the OptiSpan podcast with Matt Caberline. I think he gives some really good, solid information. He's not one that will really push the hacks before pushing the lifestyle changes. And so if you don't have the money or you don't feel like you have the money, well, what can you do with the budget that you have? And what doesn't cost as much money? Because most of this, and look at the people in the blue zones. If you interview anybody in any of the blue zones across the globe, none of them are going to be, if you ask them, well, what helped you live so long? They're not going to start listing out all the supplements and the biohacks that they've been taking over the course of their lifespan. They're going to tell you're going to see it's the social connections, it's the physical activity that they're doing, the healthy foods that they're eating that are giving them that longevity. So it doesn't take a lot of time, a lot of money, a lot of, access to these things to be able to be healthy. It's just kind of get out there and do it. Make the changes, evaluate your current situation and what can you do in small increments to make it better tomorrow.
Okay. Nailed it. What does well-centered fitness mean, and how does it push back against the no pain, no gain mentality?
I'm glad you asked that. Well-centered fitness is really kind of a concept that I've labeled. It's nothing new. It's just my label to the wellness. It's really kind of the SPIES model, how I label it. So well-centered just indicates that there's that balance. When we look at wellness in general, most are going to present it as kind of a pie where, the spiritual, physical, intellectual, emotional, social, sometimes they put environmental in that. They all are kind of even pieces of the pie. And I take a different approach to that. I tend to feel that the spiritual and the physical really are more of the base of a pyramid. And then we build on top of that. You build your intellectual out feeds our kind of ability to understand our emotions, and emotions feed into the spirit, this social, and then everything kind of feeds back to the physical and spiritual. And so it's this constantly kind of growing, expanding pyramid, but it's all based around an asymptote that, you have this asymptote of perfection. And for those who don't remember their high school math, an asymptote is that line that the graph never quite hits. We always keep approaching it. We get closer and closer, but we never get right on that line. And so think of well-centered fitness being a target, and the bullseye keeps getting smaller and smaller. We're still hitting the bullseye. It becomes a little bit more difficult to hit the bullseye perfectly, but it's challenging us to get closer and closer to perfection, but we're never going to actually get to perfection. And so well-centered fitness is really balancing those areas, looking at the areas where we have some deficiency and how can we improve those and maintain the other areas. And we're constantly going to be kind of shifting around in those different areas. Some days are going to be better physically. Some days might be better spiritually. We have good days and bad days in our social connections. But that is kind of what the well-centered fitness model is all about, how it pushes against the no pain, no gain mentality. I'm kind of mixed on that. I mean, the no pain, no gain. It generally tells us that, it has to hurt in order to get better, to make it. And we don't always have to have negative stressors in our lives to make us get better. Sometimes the positives can fuel our spiritual, physical, intellectual, emotional, and social growth as well. But there does have to be a certain level of agitation to, stress on a system in order for it to adapt. And so no pain, no gain, I think takes it over the top a little bit. We always have that mentality in the bro gym, it's no pain, no gain, dude. Yeah. But we need to have a little bit of pressure on ourselves, on the system in order for it to adapt. But it doesn't have to be hurtful. So I don't know that it pushes back against it, but doesn't necessarily encourage it either. I think when we're talking about well-centered, it's just really making positive approaches towards improvement in those areas of the SPIES model. Does that make sense?
Yeah, totally. I think there's a difference between pain as in this hurts in my joints and my ligaments versus my muscles are burning though.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? And I think being in tune and being aware of your body, if just speaking on a physical aspect of it, getting uncomfortable, being uncomfortable helps you grow. And I don't think it's just physical. I think it's mental. I think it's emotional. I mean, you probably have college students where you are giving them assignments and it's mentally challenging for them. And some of them are like, oh my gosh, I just feel like I'm just going to burn out. This is so tough. But then there's probably others where they're like, you know what? This is a challenge, but it's just making me smarter. It's making me stronger. I'm obtaining, mental strength as I'm getting it. So I think, yeah, what, the old saying, what doesn't kill you makes you stronger. What doesn't break down your muscle to the point where it can't build itself back up. I think it could be good for you. You know what I mean? Like,
Yeah.
you gotta build yourself back up. You get knocked off that horse, get back on. With that being said, though, don't open yourself up to severe injury.
Yeah, and you're focusing on the physical. I think, the whole point of well-centered fitness is, again, I'm an exercise physiologist, so the principles of adaptation, the specificity, the overload principle, progression, reversibility, individuality, all those apply to the spiritual, the physical, intellectual, and emotional, and social as we are attempting to improve in those areas. And so everybody's going to adapt a little bit differently. Everybody's going to need a little bit more stress than others. We can't overdo certain areas because it's going to always work to the detriment of other areas. If I focus too much on the spiritual, I'm neglecting my spiritual health, my physical health, my intellectual might kind of coincide with that spiritual development. But, say you're, somebody that all they do is, on their knees praying 24/7. Well, that's not healthy from a physical standpoint. You're not really growing maybe in your intellect, whether it's, even understanding of your religious principles and, spiritual principles. Emotionally, you're not engaged with anything other than that one issue of praying. And then you're not interacting with people socially. So there's good and bad with all this stuff, but we can overdo certain areas and underdo other areas. And it's kind of where I always talk about opportunity cost. We have a certain amount of time in a day to do the things that we need to do. When we're looking at being well-centered, we want to be as much balanced across all of those different components or dimensions as much as possible.
Gotcha. I think this is a good segue. So you often talk about being more human, not more optimized. So what does that mean?
Well, I think, we got to be realistic. We got to be people, and again, it goes back to the whole biohacking and some of the longevity community that it's all about optimizing your health, and you have to be, strongest physically, or you have to have the best, running time, or, the leanest amount of fat, least amount of fat on your body and most amount of muscle mass. We have to be human first. We're not machines. We're not fine-tuning a machine to perform. We are growing, and this is where I think where I kind of dovetails with my We Have a Spiritual Problem podcast is, I tend to favor the approach to hard that we are in a spiritual evolution, that we are growing to be more complex and more unified as a human species. And it's not about optimization. It's about just becoming more human. And it's really kind of hard to narrow down into just one or two sentence response. But I think that's hopefully something we'll be underscoring across this podcast is that, again, it's not about optimizing our scores, not getting better numbers. It's about being better humans, being better people so that we're more functional, being able to be more purposeful, being able to be more vital to our societies.
So what exactly does that look like, though? You know what I mean? Because that could be, I guess, different societies, different cultures, different demographics, just within America alone, right? Just within our own state of Oregon, the Willamette Valley is going to be way different than Central Oregon, which is going to be way different than the Rogue Valley down in Southern Oregon, which is going to be different than the Wallowas in the northeastern portion of Oregon. And so, what does that look like exactly with so much diversity and differences?
Well, what's common about all of us? We're human, right?
Yeah.
I mean, it's that finding that commonality. You mentioned earlier, if I cut myself, do I not bleed? I think was the quote you used.
I just said when I cut, it just
Maybe
it
that's
takes
what
me
I was
longer
thinking
to
of.
heal.
Yeah. And that's at that point, I was thinking that whole quote, if I cut myself, do I not bleed? Well, that's the same thing. So whatever aspect of the individual, what your demographics are, what your ethnicity is, what your gender is, what your age is, the core of it all, we're all human. And, we all have, I think what is it? Like it's more than 90% of our genetic code is identical. So we're more the same than we are different. And so, it's more important to be looking at what makes us human than what optimizes us in our performance.
Gotcha. Well, as we launch or relaunch the Aging Well podcast, what do you hope our listeners come away with week after week?